So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our monthly seminars on international development and innovation. My name is Lorena Lombardozzi. I'm a senior lecturer in economics here at the Open University. And we are very delighted to have with us today Seth Schindler, who is a senior lecturer of urban development and transformation at the Global Development Institute, the University of Manchester. His talk is by no means the most relevant of this day, and not for actually happy reasons, but very interesting title, Emergent Geography of the Second Global Cold War. Obviously, Seth will discuss in details what is his definition of the Second Global Cold War, but very interdisciplinary, just in line with our agenda for the seminar series. So without further ado, I will just give again the few instructions. The video is being recorded and will be available for playback after. So people who don't want to be featured can ask questions in the Q&A and ask to remain anonymous. So you can just type your question in the chat box or just raise your hands. But please, if you want to be featured, introduce yourself. Also for us would be very nice to hear who you are. You are now automatically muted just to minimize noise during the presentation, but please raise your hands later on during the Q&A. You can follow us on Twitter with using the handler intdev_OU, and Heidi will put the details in the chat box if not already. Just to say that, Florian Schaffer, who is a research postdoc research fellow at OU, is noticing that we have the full team of Redefine, which is the Giles Mohan-led project here today. So they will put the question in the chat box. So without further ado, I will warn you when you have 5 minutes left. Thank you very much again. We are looking forward to your presentations. And yes, here we are. I'll put myself on mute and I will turn my camera off as well.
Thank you, Lorena. Am I audible? Yeah.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Lorena, for the introduction. And thank you to everyone at the International Development and Innovation Seminar Series at Open University, and to everyone who joined today to talk about emergent geographies of the Second Cold War. I'm going to start at the United Nations headquarters in September of 2021, when Joe Biden gave his first speech at that institution. His speech basically outlined a series of challenges that are facing the world. And he said, in order to solve them, that there has to be a multilateral or international response. He said specifically, which I think was probably targeted at China, this phrase toward the bottom, we are not seeking a new Cold War or a world divided into rigid blocs. Fast forward a few months and Xi Jinping was at the World Economic Forum. His speech paralleled Joe Biden's. I mean, he outlined almost, challenge for challenge, these major challenges facing the world at the moment, climate change, for example. And he also said that we need to have multilateral solutions. And he said, quote, that we must discard a Cold War mentality. Thus, Biden and Xi agree that they don't want a new Cold War, but actions speak louder than words. And Sino-US relations are at their lowest point in decades. In November 2019, Henry Kissinger said we're in the foothills of a new Cold War. The Financial Times even launched a special New Cold War series. And in the November-December issue of Foreign Affairs, Hal Brands and John Gaddis wrote, quote, it's no longer debatable. This is just the recent November-December of last year. It's no longer debatable that the United States and China, tacit allies during the last half of the last Cold War, are entering their own new Cold War. Not everyone is convinced, however. So in response to this article from Brands and Gaddis, Joseph Nye wrote an article that appeared in the New York Times entitled, With China, a new Cold War analogy is lazy and dangerous. So he argued that the analogy is inappropriate because the US has a very different relationship with China than it did with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Other scholars who reject the Cold War analogy do so for similar reasons. So some argue that a better analogy to the rise of China and its challenge to American hegemony is Wilhelmina Germany in the decades prior to World War I, or in the most recent issue of Foreign Affairs, Alexander Cooley and Daniel Nexon suggested that, quote, a better, albeit still strained historical analogy can be found in the 20 Years' Crisis, the fraught period between World War I and World War II. My first objective today is to reframe the debate, and I assert that the US-China rivalry should not be compared to the Cold War at all. And the Cold War is not an analogy. Rather, the Cold War and contemporary great power rivalry are discrete but related events in a series, which is structured by a much longer historical process or processes. So my intention is to convince you today that the US-China rivalry constitutes what I term the second global Cold War, and I'll explain, of course, what that means. But I think the best way to start this explanation is by way of example. So World War II and World War I. I mean, World War II is not an analogy of World War I, right? Indeed, they're different in many ways. So blitzkrieg versus trench warfare. Some countries changed sides, yet we call them first and second because they're events in a series whose underlying dynamics was the rise of emergent powers and their attempt to remake the international order. So in his recent history of what he calls the long Second World War, Richard Overy argues that, quote, the conventional view of the war understands Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese military as causes of crisis rather than its effects, which is what they were. Proper sense cannot be made of the origins of the war and its course and consequences. I lost my spot here. Proper sense cannot be made of the origins of the war and its course and consequences without understanding the broader historical forces that generated years of social, political, and international instability worldwide. Little is to be gained by separating the two giant conflicts. Both can be seen as stages of a second 30 Years' War about the reordering of the international system in a final stage of imperial crisis. So similarly, the US-China rivalry should be seen as a stage in a much longer process, namely the rise of global China and the shift of the global economy's center of gravity from the North Atlantic toward East Asia. Hence, rather than a new Cold War that is or isn't analogous to the First Cold War, we're witnessing a reopening of great power rivalry that constitutes a related Second Cold War. Thus, I'll offer an analysis of a historical process rather than a comparison of two events. And in order to sustain my claim that we're living through the beginning of the Second Global Cold War, I'll offer a brief reperiodization of the 20th century history and a reappraisal of China's role in the First Cold War. In the second part of the talk, I'll switch perspectives from great powers to other states, and I'll explore how they're responding, these other states, smaller states, for example, how they're responding to the Second Global Cold War by pursuing state spatial objectives and undertaking institutional reform, which I will argue is leading to the emergence of what I and colleagues refer to as the 21st century infrastructure state. So, offering a reperiodization of the 20th century is admittedly an ambitious project, but it's not without precedent. So for example, Robert Gerhardt recently approached World War I as a world historical event rather than a European conflict. So he argues that we need to reconsider the common wisdom that it ended in November 1918 simply because the guns on the Western Front fell silent. Indeed, the conflict continued in Turkey in the wake of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, in Russia, in China, and parts of the former Habsburg Empire. So Gerhardt's global analysis leads him to conclude that the war actually ended in 1923. Another example is the book I just mentioned a moment ago by Richard Overy, Blood and Ruins. It's a history of the long Second World War, in which he argues was animated by the drive for territorial empires among the Axis powers. He states that Germany's, quote, war against Poland can better be understood as the final stage in a largely uncoordinated movement to found new territorial empires in the 1930s, rather than the conventional view that sees it as the opening conflict of the Second World War. So instead of the invasion of Poland, Overy marks the opening salvo of World War II to 1931, with the Japanese invasion in earnest of mainland China. So in the first case, the reperiodization of World War I is underpinned by changing perspectives from a conventional Euro-American perspective to a global one. In the second case, the reperiodization is born out of a change of focus by putting imperial conquest front and center. Both of these moves, changing perspectives and changing focus, can help us rethink commonly held assumptions about the Cold War. And that's what I do right now. So, in line with global history that decenters Europe as the privileged stage upon which events of world historical significance take place, I argue that the First and Second Cold Wars are at least in part animated by China's challenge to the world system. My narrative borrows from historians who have contributed to the reappraisal of China's role in the Cold War as a central protagonist rather than a second-tier regional power. So in the words of Chen Jian, quote, the position of Mao's China in the Cold War in many respects was not peripheral, but central. And I recommend all three of these books. So on the left, Jeremy Friedman's book, he really explores the depths of the Sino-Soviet competition and shows that in many instances, Soviet conduct was a response to Beijing. So if we were looking for the sources of Soviet conduct, we may have to look in China at that time. On the right, Greg Brzezinski's book shows how at times during the Cold War, Washington viewed Beijing as its primary antagonist rather than Moscow. Now, the Chinese Communist Party, a central protagonist then in the Cold War, has pursued a very consistent set of objectives since before its victory over the Japanese Imperial Army or the Kuomintang. These objectives were to make China strong, wealthy, and central to world affairs. So while these objectives had not changed since at least the 1940s, the CCP's strategy for achieving them have changed dramatically. As early as 1927, Mao told his countrymen that, quote, if you want the nation to become strong and prosperous, the people should not bear oppression and exploitation. They should rise up in revolution, unite, strike against the great powers, and drive away the warlords. So it's quite clear that for Mao, the best way for China to become strong, wealthy, and central to world affairs was to export armed revolution. Particularly after Khrushchev's secret speech, Mao sought to establish China as a leader among Asian and African states by establishing his anti-imperialist credentials, rather than by adhering strictly to Marxist-Leninist doctrine. So this led China to offer support to states and groups as diverse as, say, Tanzania under Julius Nyerere, Algeria under Ahmed Ben Bella, guerrillas in South Vietnam, the PLO, the Black Panther Party. And support was based, again, largely on the commitments of these groups to anti-imperialism and recognition that China was a leader among African and Asian states, rather than some sort of analysis, a Marxist analysis of, say, class structure, political economy, or the likelihood of a revolution. So you can compare perhaps this with someone like Karen Brutens, the Soviet theoretician, whose subsequent 2-volume study on national revolutions really focused on some of these social and political dynamics. Now, all of this, of course, changed during the Cultural Revolution when China turned in on itself, but I do want to point out that at least according to McFarcar and Schoenhals's classic work, Mao's Last Revolution, many Red Guards were motivated by the sense that these original objectives, again, to make China strong, wealthy, and central to world affairs, were being undermined by capitalist roaders within the state. So capitalist roaders are those individuals in positions of power who had taken the capitalist road. So this, of course, changed over time throughout the Cultural Revolution. But, you know, this was everyone from Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping to later Lin Biao and even Zhou Enlai toward the very end. So after the death of Mao, the arrest of the Gang of Four, obviously I'm going quite quickly here, but Deng Xiaoping sidelined Hua Guofeng and came to power in earnest. And he curtailed support for revolutionary governments and movements. Sarah Lorenzini, historian, explains how Deng told African leaders that actually economic openness and relations, there was just a comment, perhaps I'm not sure, perhaps Heidi, someone
I can see the slides.
You can, okay.
I can ask is it slide 8 that we are?
Yes, we're on slide 8. That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, please continue. Thanks.
Thank you. So instead of world revolution, Deng urged cautious political and economic experimentation and reforms, with which, at least within China, we're probably all somewhat familiar. Lawrence Luty frames this shift succinctly and
Yeah, we lost you for a few seconds.
Hello. Okay, I'm back. Sorry, I apologize. I do have some spotty internet here. My
No
point here
worries.
is that the objectives did not change. This was simply a novel strategy that Deng was pursuing. So Deng remained committed to the original objectives that constitute basically the reason for being of the CCP. And this point was not lost on his biographer, Ezra Fogel, who wrote that Deng's personal identity was inseparable from the national effort to rid China of the humiliation it had suffered at the hands of other countries and to restore it to a position of greatness. So Deng certainly succeeded in engineering China's transformation into a strong and powerful nation. But I want to seize on Vogel's use of the word restore. It is Xi Jinping who has launched an expansive restorative project, but I argue that we have to understand it in the context of world affairs and political economy. So rather than as a singular individual project of Xi. And for that, we have to turn to Chimerica, which refers to the increasingly integrated nature of the American and Chinese economies, which was the bedrock of the emergence of really the most productive global value chains the world has ever seen in the 1990s and 2000s. These combined American capital and know-how with Chinese labor. So Chimerica, I think, is very much a love story, and it's really of Shakespearean proportions. So spoiler alert, anyone who hasn't seen or read Romeo and Juliet, it does not end well for the lovers. And the same can perhaps be said for Chimerica. So it indeed fostered tremendous economic growth on both sides of the Pacific, but it also unleashed the social forces that destabilized both societies. In both countries, this growth episode left many people behind. So think of the US. The white working class in the American Rust Belt was deeply resentful of the never-ending offshoring of jobs that undermined the very foundations that had structured social life since the 1950s. Of course, production processes were offshored elsewhere, Mexico, for example, but nevertheless, the China shock, as David Autor calls it, was very real. For many Americans, tenuous membership in the middle class was threatened by this yawning and growing inequality, inaccessible healthcare, crushing student debt, and in vain attempts to maintain middle-class living standards, many American workers took on multiple low-wage, non-unionized jobs, and meanwhile they were essentially priced out of cities that were gentrifying beyond recognition. Now, in China, there were many alienated groups. Among the most alienated included workers and state-owned enterprises whose social worlds just disintegrated in spectacular fashion when traditional work units were disbanded. Rural migrants, of course, who worked long hours in poor conditions, powering China's export-led growth, and peasants forced to relinquish land and make way for large-scale urban development projects. These discontents were understandably nostalgic for the simplicity of the Mao era, when public institutions underpinned the reproduction of social life. To add insult to injury, the very people who were charged with protecting the Maoist social order benefited the most from its dismantling, the cadres of the CCP. In this period, particularly in the early 2000s, corruption knew no bounds, and CCP officials forged close ties with China's growing business elite. In 2002, capitalists could even become card-carrying members of the CCP. So I think that the 2008 financial crisis accelerated processes of social and environmental change and political change in both countries and forced a reckoning on both societies in the years that followed. Both countries experienced political earthquakes, but they played out very differently in the US and China given the differences in their political systems. The backlash in the US was visceral, just visceral anger from below that catapulted Donald Trump to the Oval Office in an election that was supposed to be an epic contest between the country's two great elite political dynasties, the Clintons and the Bushes. In China, political reform obviously did not come from below. Instead, it was launched from the very highest echelons of the state and the CCP. Xi Jinping sidelined rivals, as is well known, and he subordinated the private sector to the party. Most importantly, he is committed to achieving national rejuvenation. And now this term has a long history in the parlance of the CCP, but for purposes of this talk, it's important to note that it's consistent with the original objectives of making China strong, wealthy, and central to world affairs. What's important to note here is that both countries launched restorative political projects within a few years of one another. So Make America Great Again, National Rejuvenation, Build Back Better, all of these projects aim to restore an imagined past, yet they're mutually exclusive. The extent to which the Chinese civilizational state can be rejuvenated will be limited if America becomes great again. Likewise, a rejuvenated China that is able to remake the international order may inhibit the US from building back better. So rather than focusing on individuals, either Donald Trump or Xi Jinping, the contemporary rivalry, I argue, can be explained as a result of these long-term social and economic and political processes. Now, that's a perspective, but it doesn't tell us how we should analyze the current moment. And here I advocate drawing on contemporary Cold War historiography. Cold War historians increasingly reject the orthodox view that the Cold War was an epic contest between Washington and Moscow. A new generation of scholars began conducting multilingual research in newly available archives around the world, and taking a cue from Audar and Westat, who coined the term global Cold War, they decenter the Cold War, again, from this view of two blocks organized hierarchically around Washington and Moscow, and they emphasize its pericentric nature, the horizontal connections rather than vertical hierarchies. So Łukasz Stanek and Christina Schwenkel highlight horizontal connections between East Germany and between planners, architects, builders in East Germany and Eastern Europe, and their counterparts in Northern Vietnam after the war, in the Middle East, and in Ghana. And there were centers of politicking in the global Cold War that were extremely influential, Cuba, for example, or Algiers, and they force us to recognize the agency of small states and non-state actors. Finally, there were boomerangs, as the great powers were lured into regional conflicts, such as perhaps the war in Vietnam or Afghanistan, and they were coaxed to act against their best interests by small states and savvy leaders. Recently, Hal Brands published a book on the US-China rivalry, and I have to admit I've not read it yet, it just came out, but he's explained it in a series of podcast appearances. And he argues that we should learn from history, Cold War history. I think by we, he seems to mean the United States and particularly the US government. In contrast, I argue we should learn from Cold War historiography and interpret the US-China rivalry as a global event that exhibits some of these same dynamics as the Cold War. Cold War historiography offers us tools to understand the present, and let's take for example the elephant in the room, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think it has a complex regional dynamic, yet it's rapidly drawing in the US and China. Let's not imagine for one second that Washington or Beijing are in the driver's seat determining events. They're both responding to events, but they're also doing so because they're responding to one another. And that's quite similar then to the way that Cold War historians interpret the Cold War. I'll close the first segment of the talk by offering an explanation as to why international relations scholars like Hal Brands, who are close to the American foreign policy establishment, particularly those who speak of the US in the first person plural, insist on interpreting the US that the Cold War is an analogy to the US-China rivalry or not. I think the so-called American century is based on the twin achievements of destroying fascism and communism. If it turns out then that the Cold War was merely paused and that the US is actually in a comparatively weaker position now against China than it ever was against the Soviet Union, then this pillar of national mythology is ruined. A process-based approach like the one I've proposed here shows that the supposed American victory in the Cold War was not particularly resounding, and it seems clear that the US squandered its unrivaled position during the unipolar era in two costly wars which achieved very little. For scholars whose identity is tied to the American mission of being the leader of the so-called free world, then viewing the US-China rivalry as a continuation of the Cold War is simply traumatic. For the rest of us, it's safe to say that the world is in the beginning of the second global Cold War. And with that, I'm going to move to the second part of the talk, and explain how states are adapting to the second global Cold War. Most importantly, I'm going to chart the emergence of the 21st century infrastructure state. Now, this part of the, sorry, I just want to keep my timer on. This part of the talk draws on two publications. An article that appeared in Transactions of the Institute of British Geographers last year. It was co-authored with Jessica DiCarlo and Dinesh Paudel, and a subsequent book that I co-authored with Jessica DiCarlo, and the contributors in this book explore these dynamics in a host of countries across Eurasia, Africa, and Latin America, as well as provide thematic interventions. So the book will be published later this summer. First and foremost, one of the most significant differences between the First and Second Cold Wars is their territorial logics. So the First Global Cold War was animated by the zero-sum contest to control territory. And for the most part, territory was associated with one bloc or another, or with one power. So the primary American security doctrine was containment, right? So fear of friendly states falling like dominoes animated American policy. And meanwhile, the Soviets and Chinese feared encirclement. Therefore, most territory was associated with one of these powers or one bloc, and great powers didn't operate openly in the same space. So if territory was in the American bloc, then the Soviets or Chinese had to operate surreptitiously. Instead, they sought to expand the territories in which they could operate at the expense of their rivals. And this is no longer the case. The United States and China both operate in the same spaces. And this point was not lost on Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State in the Trump administration, who stated in a speech at the Nixon Presidential Library, "This isn't about containment. Don't buy that. It's about a complex new challenge that we've never faced before. The USSR was closed off from the free world. Communist China is already within our borders." Thus, rather than a zero-sum competition to control territory, there's a competition to achieve network centrality. And you can see that in financial, trade, digital, and strategic production networks. Today, my focus is on infrastructural networks and territory. So third states then hedge between the US and China as they pursue their own state spatial objectives. Here I draw on the scholarship of Cheng-Chi Kwik, who focuses on hedging, and he also focuses on infrastructure. He has a great co-authored book called Rivers of Iron. The point I'd like to make here is that I'd emphasize that the neoliberal era led to an infrastructure gap, and that is increasingly recognized as a kind of major inhibitor of growth in global development policymaking circles. This infrastructure gap emerged because during the neoliberal era, so say like maybe you could say from the mid 80s, at least when global development policy was neoliberalized, to the mid 2000s, infrastructure investment in this period was really left to the private sector. Most private sector investment, however, that did flow into infrastructure in the global south was concentrated in the purchase of existing city-based infrastructure systems that were privatized, right? So typically in the wake of a structural adjustment loan from international financial institutions. So you can think of the municipal water systems in, say, Buenos Aires or Dar es Salaam that were privatized and purchased by northern firms. However, there was a significant shortfall of investment in large-scale connective infrastructure, like greenfield transportation infrastructure, for example. The Belt and Road Initiative has changed this, and it has allowed many states to pursue what Neil Brenner calls state spatial objectives. So many of these objectives are long-standing, and they predate the onset of the Second Global Cold War. Some of them even date back to the First Global Cold War. In all cases, however, they involve the construction of infrastructure that is not attractive to, historically anyway, to private sector investors from the OECD. So in order to pursue these objectives, these projects, infrastructure projects, many states are forced to undertake some sort of state restructuring or institutional reform in order to either resituate power from one part of the bureaucracy or state apparatus to another, or simply to create what Sam Hickey calls pockets of effectiveness. So in the paper in Transactions, Jessica Dinesh and I give examples from Laos and Nepal. And in both cases, these countries pursued long-standing state spatial objectives as a result of the BRI, or they were able to pursue them as a result of the BRI. So in Laos, the objective was to go from landlocked to land-linked and become a kind of regional transportation hub. And in Nepal, it was to reduce dependence on India by building trans-Himalayan infrastructure. Both of these were achieved, at least in part, in the context of BRI. So the outcome, however, of the state restructuring and institutional reforms is the emergence of the 21st century infrastructure state. The notion of the infrastructure state was developed by historian Jo Gouldy in her excellent work Roads to Power, in which she shows how newly established institutions and bureaucracies in Britain mobilized domestic capital to build infrastructure and create national economic space in the 1700s. We borrow this term, but in contrast, we argue in the paper that the 21st century infrastructure state mobilizes global capital rather than domestic capital in order to build infrastructure that creates transnational economic space. Of course, it can do both mobilize global and domestic capital. But the legitimacy of the 21st century infrastructure state is based at least partly on its ability to realize these state spatial objectives, which have become the sine qua non of national development. It's not building infrastructure for infrastructure's sake, but rather the construction of infrastructure is seen as a turnkey process that results in development, broadly speaking. Typically, this is folded into industrial policy. So again, in the paper we wrote about Laos and Nepal, but examples abound. So you could think about Turkey, where infrastructure is deeply related to the current government's national development strategy. I think it was 2016 that when running for re-election, Erdogan said that the AKP, the Justice and Development Party, was the only party that could undertake crazy projects, infrastructure projects. Now, these are not only domestic projects, but the state spatial strategy is transnational indeed. And this includes an ambitious plan to establish a sphere of influence in the Caucasus and Central Asian region. And again, this predates actually the Second Global Cold War, but it was largely shelved for a period, and it was resurrected in the context of the BRI. So, or the BRI, we can say makes its pursuit possible once again. Turkey and China signed an MOU to formally align the Middle Corridor Plan with the Belt and Road initiatives. And here, this text is from Erdogan. It's in an op-ed that appeared relating the Turkish and Chinese dreams, how they're similar and so on. Alternatively, we could turn to Tanzania, whose industrial policy since 2010 is thoroughly spatialized. So it relies on building 4 corridors, kind of has a regional division of labor, transportation links that connect Dar es Salaam and the eastern coastal area to the Lake District, as well as to the Zambian Copper Belt. And its cornerstone was the construction of a $10 billion port that would actually, if it were built, have been the largest port in Africa. And it was going to be funded by the Chinese government and built by a Hong Kong-based construction company. The port never materialized. It was put on hold. And after there was a kind of shift in the government, so a kind of wild card president, maybe a kind of disruptor, you can say, an outside candidate won an election, John Magufuli. He complained about the terms of the loan, and yet he continued to borrow from alternative sources to fund other infrastructure projects, which ultimately led to a row with the IMF. So here we see a country that was, under Magufuli's leadership, alienating both sides rather than hedging between them. And ultimately, however, interestingly, China was invited back to participate in the construction of a railway. So what's in it for Beijing, you may ask, given Magufuli's previous criticism? I think this illustrates how competition serves to encourage great powers to make decisions that may indeed not be in their best interest. So again, I think we see this at this current moment with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Both the US and China are hurriedly adapting to the situation and not only reacting to events on the ground, but reacting to one another, while very clearly, at least Zelensky is trying to draw in support from anywhere he can get it, but the US and also European Union. So we'll see if the US and China are indeed drawn further into this conflict. So I'm going to start to wrap up, but I just want
10 minutes left, Seth. Thank you.
10 minutes. Okay, sorry. You know,
yes.
I'm actually going to start to wrap up. That went quite a bit quicker. Usually I go over, so I'm going to end a little bit sooner than anticipated. But I want to conclude then by just drawing your attention to an initiative that I've launched with colleagues at the University of Manchester and elsewhere. So we began this project, or this is very much a collective project, what I've presented here. I mentioned Jessica and Dinesh, but there are many other people involved. We launched a seminar and organized a seminar with friends and colleagues this year in the fall, and funding was secured last year for 3 brilliant graduate students who started their doctoral studies this fall. And they're kind of the engine of the group, partly because they have more time to read than many staff members. But the group meets regularly, and it includes friends from all over. So Canada, Turkey, Australia, Iran, Sweden, Germany, Argentina, India. And later this year, we're going to launch an observatory. well, a website, but we're calling it an observatory because it will host original content and analysis as well as a podcast. But we also want to include an archive of documents relevant to the Second Global Cold War that will hopefully be useful to ourselves and other researchers, perhaps some people in the audience. And it's very much a work in progress and a very friendly group. So if you're interested in learning more, please feel free to get in touch. The barriers of entry are rather low. I think really the only one, there's significant disagreement on many issues. The only thing I think that we all do agree on is that we need to take a process-based approach and see this as a second global Cold War rather than an analogy of the Cold War. And indeed root our analysis in history, draw on Cold War historiography, and then kind of study the manifestations of the Second Global Cold War and ground our research in many different places. So that's what all of us are committed to doing, and feel free to get in touch if you'd like to be involved in any way whatsoever. But with that, I would like to conclude a little bit early. I apologize, Lorena. I'm not very good with time, but I hope we have a good, we have more time for discussion then. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Seth, for this very fascinating and rich talk. And we're really glad that, because this is a very interdisciplinary research seminar series, that, I mean, a geographer like you, a very thick, solid geographer background, merge like historical, both literature, scholarship, and events. So yeah, I have also like some questions, but because we have many and many participants are, I know, directly or indirectly working on similar issues, I will just open the floor for questions. So please, guys, raise your hand. Don't be scared. You know that this is a very informal group. So I can see one hand raised is Les. Please, if you don't mind, introduce yourself so that we are mostly aware discussion. Thanks, Les. And then John, so just these two, so we start. Thank you. Now,
okay,
yes.
Okay. So yeah. Before I couldn't see the icon for the microphone.
Yeah. I'm gonna make people present. Okay. Great.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think everything you said made sense, but I'm just wondering why you collectively use the label Second Global Cold War, which implies greater analogies than correspond to your analysis. Although it depends on how people interpret the first Cold War, and of course that remains contentious. I mean, just as one example, I mean, competition to build infrastructure as a means to gain political advantage seems, and in ways that may even undermine the political aims behind that decision, seems just a different universe than the first global Cold War, where it was driven, I think, by one side aiming for a neo-colonial control over natural resources, while the other side committed itself on an ideological political basis to any movement which would resist that neo-colonial agenda. And that's why there were devastating military wars all over the world. I mean, because that is the form taken by the political rivalry for shaping the future of the world. Now, of course, there still are some wars, but I'm not sure that they are driven by, or I'm not sure any are driven by a rivalry between the present great powers. I mean, so the Cold War was always a euphemism because it disguised those devastating wars in so many places in two senses, pretended almost that they weren't happening or that they weren't wars, or at least that they weren't the fault of the US government. So I'm wondering why you collectively have adopted this label, which may give the wrong impression.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thanks,
sure.
Do you want to reply immediately to this one, or do you want to collect another question?
I mean, I can take this one quite quickly. I think this is it's a great question. So, I mean, again, I'm not implying that it's an analogy whatsoever. It's just like World War II. I've never heard anyone say it's an analogy to World War I. These are a series of events within a much broader historical process. So they can be similar or different. Indeed, there are many differences between the two Cold Wars, the current one that I think we're in a Cold War at the moment, and the previous one. And you've mentioned some of them, but I want to clarify that infrastructure, this competition to build infrastructure, and of course there was plenty of infrastructure built in the first Cold War. Think of Ciudad Guyana, where the Americans helped Venezuela build a new city. Aswan Dam was, of course, contested, the Tazara Railway, etc., etc., etc. Instead, infrastructure is a field of competition between the great powers, and I think that there are plenty of other fields of competition. So the digital networks, technologies, or Britain is now going to strip Huawei out of all of its networks. This is a major field of competition. We can see many others, strategic production networks of things like robotics, semiconductors, and so on. Who controls those? So again, I think the overarching theme in this one, the overarching objective of both sides is to achieve network centrality in all of these fields, right? So that you can then control that particular network. And building infrastructure is one way to achieve network centrality in the sense that you organize territory, or you determine the way that it's organized and integrated within other networks, the global economy, namely. So I think that is perhaps something that's quite different between this Cold War and the last Cold War. But I'm not saying that it's an analogy whatsoever. It's just repeated events, or two discrete events in a much longer process.
Thank you very much. I will then ask Zhang Xin to introduce herself and ask a question. Yeah. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. So it's a fascinating talk. I should have read your article before. I downloaded it a long time ago. Haven't read it, but it's a fascinating story. I'm just curious, the logic, territorial logic, the differences described between the first global Cold War and the second Cold War, the territorial logic. What is the cause for the shift of this territorial logic? It seems you indicated that the shift is happening within the larger or broader processes, right? I just wonder what is this processes, and if the shift of territorial logic is indeed what you described, I wonder if we might be witnessing a somewhat going back to the territorial logic of the first Cold War in the recent period. Supposedly potential decoupling between U.S. and China. Does that imply we might be gradually sliding back to that kind of territorial logic in the first Cold War? Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. Do you want me to collect another couple of questions? Do you?
It's up to you. I mean, I don't know how you usually organize this seminar.
I do, I collect a couple, but you can actually, start replying and then we.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, Zheng, that's a great question. So why the difference? I think you kind of mentioned, you answered it almost yourself when you mentioned decoupling, and think of that quote from Mike Pompeo, that it was almost impossible to imagine the kind of territorial logic from the first Cold War, because in so many ways the U.S. and Chinese economies and societies are so deeply integrated, and so I think that's part of it. So if you're a U.S. strategist, say Mike Pompeo, and you can't kind of control territory and contain China, then you have to compete with China within these territories that you're cooperating, right? In which you're both operating, and you have to compete in a number of fields. And how do you compete? I think that's why we see some of these fields are becoming major theaters or fields of competition. Again, infrastructure. Why infrastructure? Because with infrastructure, if you control infrastructure networks, then you can control resource flows and the orientation of that territory. Why digital networks? Because then you can exclude rivals, right? So we can perhaps understand why some of these fields are more competitive than others. But I think you're definitely right. I mean, for a while, it seemed like even the most ardent China hawks in Washington had shelved the objective of decoupling. It was just simply not possible. And there were a number of countries that tried. So really interesting, you know, in the COVID support package that the Japanese government put together for Japanese firms, there was money available for firms that would reshore production, or at least move production out of China. And yet everyone started to think for a while that decoupling would be impossible. And I'm not so sure. I mean, who knows? If it is possible to decouple, then of course you can go back to a kind of logic of containment, encircling, these kinds of zero-sum territorial conflicts. But for the time being, I think that would be years ahead. And for the time being, we're going to be in this, live in this world in which there's a kind of coupled competition, right? So this kind of weaponizing interdependency type argument that people make. And so I think we're going to continue to see the territorial logic that I've outlined here play out for some time.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to read two questions coming from Sam Rogers, who is a part of the Redefine group, and then pass the floor to Gideon, who raised his hand. So thanks for the great talk. Two questions. As the first Cold War finished, given the current Moscow's versus the West conflict? And second question is, are all states infrastructure states? And then, yeah, Gideon, please, hi, introduce yourself and ask questions. Welcome.
Oh, you're muted, Gideon. Good
Yeah,
to see
you're
you.
muted.
You're muted.
Sorry. Hello, everyone. I'm Gideon from Cologne. Yeah, my question relates also to the question how we can better understand or research the Second Cold War. I think your argument about a process-based approach towards understanding the general picture is quite convincing, but I really wonder about how we can ground the research here, and especially how we can avoid a certain analytical conflation here, because it seems like the complexity is so overwhelming that we could maybe be a little bit tempted to interpret almost every event, every process we observe as being sort of embedded in the Cold War. So to me, it would be really interesting how you in your research handle it and how you also critically reflect your research here.
Great questions. So thank you, Sam. I'll start with your questions. So yeah, I mean, this is a great question. Is the first Cold War finished? It seems, I just read an article by in the New York Times by a journalist who had been posted to Moscow, and then she interviewed well, a politician who was apparently former KGB agent, I guess, and you can find the article, but she says that she kept hearing over and over again that, you know, this guy that she was interviewing, he was accused of killing, I think he was accused of killing one of the first time that that Moscow assassinated a former KGB agent in the UK. And he said, well, the Cold War is not over. And she said she heard that a lot in Russia. And I think perhaps this narrative that it ended. I mean, you do hear the Americans insist on saying that they've won the Cold War. I think surely that has to be called into question. If you know, the more I read about the end of the Cold War, the more ambiguous it is, right? I mean, I think Sergei Plavie's book is quite good. He frames it as a kind of competition between the Russian nationalists versus the empire builders, and then you had the nationalists and a number of Soviet states just decide that they didn't need the empire anymore, and that hardly isn't a resounding American victory, right? So rather than some sort of Soviet collapse. Usually you hear this notion of collapse in the US. So is it finished? Is this a resumption? I mean, I definitely think this is very much the same hostility that is being reanimated or at the moment. And then are all states infrastructure states? No, of course not. I mean, I think you have to have some of those criteria that I listed, where infrastructure is an answer to solve, it's a turnkey answer to solve other developmental problems. Nevertheless, there is an infrastructure gap that the private sector, at least private sector from OECD, pension funds, for example, don't want to fund. It's too risky. So they'll buy a water company because you can just kind of figure out, you know, look at their assets, their debts, how many customers they have, how much you'll have to invest to improve it, and then decide if it's a good buy. It's much more difficult to decide whether or not you want to build a railway from Addis Ababa to Djibouti, right? It's very challenging, very risky, and so for that you need states, and that's of course why the BRI is so attractive. But states do want to pursue these risky projects, and for a long time they were unable to do so. And so I think infrastructure states see the pursuit of some of these infrastructure projects as their kind of reason for being, at least, and achieving them is linked to their legitimacy. And so again, they seek to mobilize foreign capital in order to create this kind of transnational economic space. So in East Africa now, you can take a railway from Djibouti to Addis, and then take a highway from Addis to Nairobi, and then another railway from Nairobi to Mombasa. And this is all built by Chinese firms. And so you're kind of integrating this transnational space. And these infrastructure states, 21st century infrastructure states, are seeking to create that sort of space. And Gideon, thank you very much. This question of how to research it is a great one. And this is something we've grappled with in the seminar. And this is why we turned to Cold War historiography. Again, not Cold War history, but Cold War historiography, to look at kind of how Cold War historians grapple with that conflict, because it was equally complex, right? And you can see it everywhere. And they've had these really interesting debates. So where do you situate the Cold War? Is it in a refugee camp along the Vietnamese-Cambodian border? Is it at some kind of testing center in Nevada with like military families where they're stationed? Is it, you know, I don't know, at a radar station in Iceland? The Cold War can, in theory, be studied at all of these places, and yet it was a global conflict, as Odd Arne Westad said. So if you can almost study it anywhere, then you know, you can't grasp it, right? And so I think one historian said that this kind of, you know, you want to, on the one hand, capture this great power rivalry, because that was the context, right? I mean, that did exist. We can't just forget that there was great power rivalry. And then on the other hand, we want to capture these lived experiences, and capturing this kind of total view of the global Cold War is really the kind of holy grail of Cold War studies among historians, and it's very challenging. And I don't know a single historian who does it well, but I would say, or who does it in total. There are plenty who do it well, but it's like, it's elusive, right, to really do that. But I think one way you can do it is to kind of, when geographers might call it multi-scalar research, where you have to understand the drivers at the global scale. And it's not always downward, it's up as well, because kind of the local can draw in those global powers, as I've mentioned. But this like interscalar, multi-scalar research has to be accounted for. A really nice book is in Cold War studies, Mecca of Revolution, where I think it's Jeffrey Byrne is his name. You know, he shows how he first looks at the Algerian Civil War, situates it globally, but then also within the French colonial empire, and then the politics within Algeria, and then he kind of drills down into the city. And Algiers was, according, I think Amilcar Cabral is the one who said that Algiers is a Mecca of revolution, because you have all these different groups that were there, including, you know, Black Panthers. Eldridge Cleaver had a house with like 50 Black Panthers there at one point, and then Timothy Leary showed up with a suitcase full of LSD. So it's a really, really fascinating book. But I think this kind of multi-scalar nature to kind of capture this lived reality, as well as these very real, actually existing geopolitics and everything in between, is the way that we have to do it.
Thank you very much. So I'm gonna read one question from Tamir So fascinating talk and research set. I'm wondering if a Gramscian IR and IB approach on how global crises of accumulation interact with moments of geopolitical reordering could illuminate, maybe explain the periodization of the series of moments in the global Cold War narratives, in the sense of how infrastructure and other state spatial strategies drive or are driven by this intense moment of geoeconomic and geopolitical crisis. In short, are all global Cold Wars accompanied by massive infrastructure strategy? And yeah, unfortunately, she has very shady internet connection. So you might want to reply to that.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think, let's see where to begin. So, if by the kind of Gramscian perspective, we're talking about this notion of an interregnum that a number of people have written well about and could speak to better than I could, I guess. Well, it remains to be seen, but certainly we can see that there is an attempt from China to remake the kind of international system in more of a Westphalian order, right? I don't think it's radically different than the US-led international order. It's more Westphalian. Perhaps there are fewer responsibilities for states. It's more built on bilateralism rather than multinational institutions in which members have responsibilities. And therefore, there's a kind of supposedly more respect for sovereignty. We might see something like that emerge. In contrast, the United States, we know this order very well, the international order that it would like to rejuvenate, or Biden is trying to reinvigorate with multilateralism. I think the thing for me is that where I would also draw on Gramsci is that, or the notion of hegemony is that both of these types of both projects are hegemonic, and as we know, all hegemonic projects are incomplete. They fail to totalize. So whether or not we see the kind of stabilization in some sort of new order that emerges on the, in a number of years or at the other end of the second global Cold War, it's built on some sort of lie, right? Like, so for the American one, we know all of the lies very well. It's supposedly that all states are equal and there are these responsibilities. But if you're, the US operated along with its closest allies, a network of black prison sites, and it doesn't adhere to its own rules. It doesn't join the very international institutions that it hopes other states would join. Israeli government just assassinated an Iranian scientist inside of Israel, and of course, inside of Iran, and nothing happened. And so I think these lies are very apparent. Similarly, I don't believe that this common refrain from Beijing that it doesn't meddle in the affairs of other countries. So of course that's equally a lie when push comes to shove. It will certainly meddle when it has to, when it wants to. So I think we could see the stabilization of a new hegemonic order, and it are all Cold Wars accompanied by infrastructure competitions. There's certainly no reason why they have to be. The last one, interestingly, I think was and differently from this one. So in the first Cold War, infrastructure was a kind of cornerstone of modernization theory. And I find it fascinating to compare the Soviet and American styles of infrastructure construction. Really, when they arrived in countries, they almost did the exact same thing, right? Both the Soviet and American aid were deeply tied to modernization theory. China's projects were somewhat different. So you can see Tazara Railway, you had the World Bank and a number of other countries do feasibility studies and said, well, this simply isn't possible. You can't build a railway here. And then Chinese work teams just turned up and they more or less did it by hand, right? You can read Jamie Monson's book, Freedom Railway. It's quite fascinating, very labor intensive process in comparison to American or Soviet style infrastructure construction. So, but anyway, I think in both of the first and second global Cold Wars, we can see infrastructure as a key focal point of competition, but I don't see why that would necessarily be the case. I think you could imagine an alternative history, and maybe you read about people saying that the Belt and Road Initiative is scaling back its emphasis on large-scale infrastructure in pursuit of smaller projects and emphasis on digital connectivity. And so we might see in a few years' time that actually the great powers are no longer interested in building back better or Belt and Road Initiative in its current form, and infrastructure is once again kind of forgotten or left to private sector investors.
Thank you, thank you. I don't know if there are any hands raised, but in the meantime, people might want to reflect on some questions. So I have a couple of questions for you. Thank you very much. So my question is, so I'm particularly interested in this historization of geographies. And I was wondering whether the neoliberal conflation, I totally agree that the infrastructure gap and the role of BRI become relevant nowadays because there is a sort of shortfall of capital and like investments coming from the neoliberal system, and that's it. But if we go let's say 2 decades earlier than that, we have seen the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan is a very specific way of conceiving development coming from the West, because it put the emphasis on production and employment. So I was wondering, how do you locate in your periodization and in this, how you justify and how you explain within the First Cold War this, profile? And it goes like, kind of is linked to my second question, which is like in this very interesting narrative, which in a way makes sense that there is a, the territorial logic, the ideology variables disappeared. But I mean, to me, it was a really, really relevant and core explanatory variable to seek expansion, and this is linked to the way of development. So I was wondering if in this dichotomy, which is the third and concluding question, you see any specificities in this, binary ways of perceiving global competition, because this is basically we are in an hegemonic capitalist system, of course, but can you identify along these lines any specificity in this way of conceiving it? And I have another question from Emma Mosley, so I will just let her speak because I'm sure she has a very interesting one. Hello, Emma.
Hey, Emma.
Thank you, Lorena. Hi, Seth. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. Lorena, my question was sort of sparked by yours in a way, because of course I'm sure, as you both know, Germany has launched a new Marshall Plan for Africa. I mean, if ever you wanted a lovely connection with what you're doing, and I have not particularly looked at it apart from with astonishment at the choice of phrasing and so on. But I suspect it would very much reveal some of these things that you've talked about, Seth. So I mean, I'd love to hear your answer to Lorena's question and any thoughts that you have on that. And I guess the other thing I would say that, oddly enough, I'm just writing a chapter now on blended finance with a really wonderful, some mature PhD student, Sarah Hughes McClure, and coming at it from this perspective of the financing of these new infrastructure states. There's such an important sort of relationship there, because what we're tracing through is this really quite revolutionary approach to development finance. And I think there's a wonderful conversation to be had across what you're doing and what's happening, including thinking about the sort of the changes in, say, First and Second Cold Wars, about the actors involved, what's different, what's changing, and how these new imperatives are being are in the context of new financial tools, capacities, and orientations and actors, how they're also part of this story.
Yeah. So great questions. Thank you both. There's a lot there. I think I would start by just reminding everyone that the Marshall Plan, of course, as we all know, was kind of animated by just kind of standard modernization theory. And a lot of states at the time were trying to pursue novel developmental projects, right? So a lot of post-colonial states in Africa, for example, rejected their role in the global economy as providers of natural resources. And so in the 1960s, in particular, we saw major advancements in industrial output. Industrialization in Africa outpaced Latin America in that decade. And there was significant progress made if you just look at the numbers. But I think then in the 1970s, when there was a global economic crisis, a lot of these projects started to run into trouble. And when they were forced into structural adjustment, I see a kind of reinsertion or resubordination of countries by international financial institutions to force them to once again be natural resource exporters, right? To put them in their place. So if you read documents from the World Bank at the time, it's like saying, well, you know, a lot of countries that are getting structural adjustment loans are not going to be manufacturing powerhouses. However, they do have an advantage in natural resources. And, you know, the World Bank then develops a number of mechanisms, and it even says that it could act as a custodian of natural resources for African countries. And so I think what I'm seeing now is then that fast forward a little bit, those types of projects, we saw global capital never really came never really was interested in African industry, but it was always interested in African resources. And what we're seeing now then is this like, well, you had the China boom and countries had plenty of cash. And that's why we're seeing a kind of reindustrialization agenda in many African countries. But in order to, but it's not to shift kind of shift industries, right? It's not to go back to those industries in the 60s that like textiles, really. I mean, of course you have textiles, but it's not really to like move up into new industries. Instead, it's to add more value in those agro-food processing sectors and in natural resources. And so that's why you need infrastructure, because, you know, a lot of these places where the initial production is taking place is rather remote. So it's to move up value chains in those kinds of industries that they were relegated to in the 1980s. And so I guess this is the question that I have is partnership with China going to be a kind of step change? Or is it really more of the same? Two really the fundamental question. So I think a lot of African states are indeed trying to, well, I would distinguish these two industrial policy objectives. One is to kind of move into more to novel industries that are, and the other is to then just kind of move up in value chains in which they're already participating. And I'm not sure if China provides a very different alternative. Where is ideology then? I really don't see a major difference in ideology. If you read Han Cheng and Wei Dong Liu's paper in Political Geography on development in China as a concept, it seems that it's very novel and very much in flux. It seems like development studies scholars in China are at the moment kind of frantically working to figure out what development means in China and trace its roots and I mean, this is a question that Chinese scholars, let's put it that way, are asking themselves at this very moment, right? So the project it's being constructed, but I don't think anyone has great answers. You can read about things like co-evolutionary pragmatism, for example, right? I mean, is this novel? I'm not really sure. I'm not convinced it's particularly a novel approach. And you have the former chief economist at the World Bank, Justin Lin, who's working now in Beijing to pioneer Chinese development policy. And again, I mean, is he going to do something that's entirely novel? There might be slight differences, but I can't imagine that it's going to be some sort of new revolutionary ideology, or you know, it's still deeply rooted in modernization theory. And so I guess for many countries, it's more political. It's like rather than ideology, it's political economic. Where can you get the most support for these projects? And is there any way, you're on your own, but can you hedge between these two great powers, or Germany or France, or like European Union, so global gateway, whatever that even means, Build Back Better World, the G7, whatever that even means. I mean, is there any way that you can kind of these are all different pots of assistance and you then try to patch them together. And where we might see differences is in the national development strategies themselves. So I think, Tanzania under Magufuli, you might see like a kind of novel articulation there, and that might be one reason why the IMF was so upset and had a falling out. But yeah, I guess that I don't know if I answered your question, Lorena. I mean, ideology is a big one, but I don't really buy this difference between kind of, I mean, authoritarianism versus democracy. I mean, if you look in Washington, this is the ideological difference. I think that's not particularly accurate in my analysis.
Yeah, no, we are on the same page. But I think it's like what you're mentioning is what in IR, and I'm not an IR person, but it's like they're trying to go like the multi-vector strategy now, when you actually have to negotiate different capital coming from different sources. Yeah. Yes. I think Philip, no, or Frank, someone has his or her hand recently. I might have unnoticed. No, I don't want to point fingers at people, but if someone or ask questions, please.
Sorry, Lorena, we're having some issues hearing you. There's a bit of a glitch going on, but Philip's turned his camera on, so I think Philip, would you like to ask a question?
To be honest, I just turned my camera on, not just that I had a question. Thank you.
Okay, no worries. Out of courtesy. Thank you. Sorry. All right. So any other question, even clarification or question for references? Let's give few minutes more. We have few minutes more. Frank, yes. So Frank was a PhD student, now as a lecturer in DPP, so in our development studies department, and his work on renewable energy in Chinese investment on renewable energy in Africa. So Frank, many thanks, Seth, for this interesting perspective around emergent geographies of Second World War. My reading of this is rather a perspective presented from a viewpoint that considers that the West, Western Europe and North America, or the East, China, considers to be the frontiers or bases around which the emergent geographies are built on. For example, you mentioned of a number of projects implemented in the global South by these global superhouses, but I wonder what African countries make of or consider of this emergence or the so-called Second Cold War.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. I mean, I think it differs from country to country, of course, but again, I think many African countries are welcoming they resist the attempts by global powers to force them to choose one side or another, right? And they're willing to accept developmental assistance and investment from many different sources. And I think that is the nature of the 21st century infrastructure state. I guess, you can think of many different examples, but I mentioned Tanzania already. You can think of Kenya, right? So the kind of Kenya vision, Vision 2030, includes all sorts of infrastructure projects, and it's particularly in the northern part of the country that was historically a frontier zone, right? So the kind of the edge of empire, really, of the British Empire in that part of the world, and it has remained a frontier, and that now it's supposedly going to be the center of all sorts of investment that is directed there from Nairobi. But it's not only the northern part of Kenya, also, as I mentioned, the central, the railway, the railway to Mombasa, and now apparently a highway that travels up toward Uganda. And so, I mean, the money for these projects is coming from all over. If you go to the LAPSET website, the Lamu Port South Sudan Ethiopia Transport Corridor website, there's a whole page just for investors. It's not only Chinese companies and investment China are active, but You know, they're plenty willing to welcome French, German, I don't know, Turkish, Persian Gulf, American capital. And so I think, again, I really see that I emphasize the state spatial strategies of the Kenyan state rather than its so ideological allegiance to or any other allegiance, political allegiance to Beijing or Washington or anyone else. I think the question is, so that's how I think many African countries are responding. The question is, where does this end, right? It's going to get tricky when you get Beijing is China's not in the Paris Club. Let's say US raises interest rates in the next few months, and then you have a wave of defaults across the world. Who is going to get their money first? Is it going to be Chinese creditors or European ones? Yeah, these questions I think remain to be seen. So it's more like maybe the question for me is instead, how are African countries responding? I think that's relatively clear. It's more, what are the implications of this strategy of hedging, right? And what happens when push comes to shove and let's say, I don't know, Kenya or any other country is unable to service its debts. That I think is going to be a question we're going to have to ask in the next year or so, probably.
Thank you. If there is no other question, I'm just going to ask you your last question that now came up, because it's a very theoretical talk, but I found it fascinating to use it like it's in an applied sense. Do you have any compelling case studies that you might want to explore using this framework that you're using?
So, yeah, I mean, the book that I shamelessly promoted includes a number, right? And we basically took this framework that we had, of the 21st century infrastructure state. The paper more or less does what I did today. It kind of starts with a big geopolitical, geoeconomic story, and then tries to ground that in country case studies. And we used Laos and Nepal. And then I was researching in Tanzania. And so the three of us met actually at a conference in Beijing in 2019. And we realized that we were kind of seeing some of these same things, and we put the paper together. And then we realized that actually this idea of the 21st century infrastructure state, we started seeing it everywhere we looked. And that's where the book emerged from, because you obviously can't be everywhere at once. So we started contacting friends and colleagues who were looking at some of these dynamics and asked if this made sense to them. And indeed, I mean, yeah, we have case studies in the book from Argentina, Ecuador, Kazakhstan, Turkey, Hungary, Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, where else? Quite a few different places, Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam.
Okay, that good application. I myself work on Central Asia, so I might be interesting to read your Kazakh case.
Sorry, I'll just say then the interesting thing I find about Kazakhstan is that the national development strategy, which does this, it really hedges between different principles, right? But including China, and it's related now to the Belt and Road Initiative, is called, sorry for my pronunciation, but Nur Lijol, right? And Nur, it means light. I guess it's related to Nur Sultan, the previous leader, but Nur Lijol means bright path. And I find it interesting that the kind of the export in a way of the China model now is this notion of, you could say, bright path in Kazakh. But, in the 1980s, we also had the export of a very different Chinese model, in this case, armed revolution, in Peru, which was also called the Shining Path. So I think you can really see the way that China has influenced the world differently at different times. And in one time, this one pathway that China offered was armed revolution, and nowadays the pathway is very different, and it has to do with kind of global connectivity and integration with markets and so on. So I mean, Kazakhstan is quite illustrative and interesting for a number of reasons, but right.
They also have a Soviet heritage of long-term state planning, which also makes a huge difference.
Indeed.
I think Frank or I said interesting view on IP, and I will just change. I'm an advocate of some form of IP in Africa and Zimbabwe, to be specific. However, it seems within this milieu, it will be difficult to make much progress. Is adding back to some form of federal Africa a good idea? 1 billion.
Yeah.
Francis, Francis, one of our PhD students.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. The only thing I guess I can say about intellectual property and standards is that this is really a field of contestation at the moment in this second global Cold War. But of course, the kind of main protagonists are at the moment the US and China. And it's really in the field, I would say, primarily of kind of all things digital and tech related. So everything from AI, semiconductors, robotics to digital standards and networks. And I think there are a number of reasons in industrial policy. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I'll have to go back to your question then.
Industrial policy, I means like, yeah, in the sense of, yeah.
I mean, look, it's definitely possible for countries to undertake industrial policy, and all of the industrial policies that I've looked at have been thoroughly spatialized. I mean, that's what I find really interesting. So spatial planning is back, right? You had spatial planning during the Cold War, 60s, 70s, modernization theory and so on, incorporated spatial planning. It was really put on hold in the neoliberal period because planners themselves were kind of kicked out of the state in many places, right? Instead of planners, you just have project managers in the West. Planning is not this integrated thing in the West, right? Where you integrate space and you think nationally or even transnationally. Instead, planning is reduced to a series of infrastructure projects, which many times, in many cases, are disconnected. And each one is undertaken by a project manager who's probably just some sort of consultant, right? And I think this might be something that China does differently. You still have a kind of notion of integrated planning. What I see happening in Africa and many other countries is that spatial planning is back, but it's subordinated to industrial policy. So it's industrial policies that have become spatialized. And you see this, like two colleagues and I have co-authored a paper that's under review. We look at how this has happened in Kenya, Saudi Arabia, and Thailand. And in all of those kind of upper middle income countries, or I guess in Saudi Arabia, quite wealthy countries, there's a kind of reincorporation of spatial planning as the state kind of seeks to gain control over the economy in new ways. In Thailand, it's the military government that is kind of creeping into all sectors of the economy. In Saudi Arabia, the objective is to diversify away from oil and gas. But in all cases, then there's this kind of really interesting component of spatial planning. So in Kenya, I mentioned LAPSET. It's the kind of infrastructuralization of the northern half of the country. In Saudi Arabia, it's NEOM. It's this kind of region that's in the northwest where you're going to like build this new city that, again, it's industrial policy. It's the idea is to like jump into the global economy at a very high level, this high-end producer services that are supposedly going to be located there, these global firms, and they want to, incubate the next Tesla or what have you. And then in Thailand, it's this Eastern Economic Corridor. And in all of the cases, this came along with state restructuring, because in each instance, you had to create a new bureaucracy. So in Kenya, it's the LAPSET authority, and it's connected to the executive. In Saudi Arabia, there are a number of like sovereign wealth fund and a number of other institutions that are answerable only to basically only to MBS, but the executive in the government. And they're pursuing this spatial strategy. And in Thailand, it's the Eastern Economic Corridor Authority, I think. But it's connected to the highest echelons of the state and essentially just to this kind of inner circle. So I think this is what's interesting, that spatial planning is back. It's subordinated to industrial policy. And in all cases, there's a kind of re-centralization in pursuit of these objectives. This is happening in many countries. I don't know about Zimbabwe, but yeah, feel free to get in touch and we can communicate more. I think we're running out of time.
Yeah, we're running out of time, but I have Susan that is our another postdoc with us asking a quick question, please, yeah. Susan. Hello? You're on mute. I'm gonna mute. Yeah. Yeah. Can you? Or you can also type the question and I'll be able to read it for you. Or I don't know if Heidi can assist us.
Yeah, everyone's got access to turn the mics and cameras on, so I'm not quite sure what's going on there.
Yeah. Oh. Sorry, no question. Okay, no worries. So without further ado, I'll thank Seth for this amazing, fantastic presentation. We had an amazing time listening to you. We look forward to read the book. So please send the link to the, to the chat box or through Heidi. We will be able to post it. So we'll really welcome advertising if it's relevant for our research.
Thank you so much.
Order a copy in our library. So our next seminars, if you actually want to join, it will be Ilya Salami, who just moved to Uppsala. They will present a talk which is actually very relevant. It's called The Specter of State Capitalism. It will be on the 6th of April. So we look forward to see you all again here, same time. And yeah, thanks again, Seth, for staying with us. And we'll keep in touch.
Thank you so much.